I believe that both museums and communities, and in fact neither of them, own the heritage that is today housed in museums. Of course, museums are today, especially museums in Europe and in the United States, but also in other places like Brazil, they are sort of the institutional repositories where layers and layers of historical experiences and cultural experiences rest in a material culture form. But of course, who owns that material is a contested issue. And that is the beauty of museums, really, because they are contested spaces and they are processes. Just to give a few examples, I think the most classical, the most well-known example of a museum that holds contested heritage is the British Museum, which owns or holds or keeps the Parthenon marbles, also called the Elgin marbles, and the choice of calling them Parthenon marbles or Elgin marbles already says something about the ownership of these materials. For a long time now, the government of Greece has requested the return of these marbles to Athens. The British Museum is at this moment not willing to return these materials. But the simple question that this issue has come up is a very interesting one, because there's no easy solution. No one will ever be able to say, well, this belongs here or there, because both sides have very strong arguments as to why the Elgin marbles or Parthenon marbles should stay in Britain or should go to Greece. And these arguments have to do with the way different stakeholders in different communities, and the museum is a stakeholder and a community just as well as the British government or the Greek government. Each of them has a certain understanding of what heritage is and where heritage belongs. So the British Museum defines itself as a world museum, a universal museum, a museum of all cultures and heritages of the world, where anyone can come to and see those pieces. But of course the question is, who has access? Who can go to London to go to the British Museum and see that material? While in Greece, of course, the argument is, well, this belongs to our history and our heritage. So this is a very powerful example of a sort of a conflict that will I don't think it's very likely that a easy solution will be found. We will be discussing this for many, many years to come. So that's an example of who owns heritage, well, both and neither. A second very powerful example is that of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation, the Repatriation Act, that has been put into force in the United States since the 1990s. And this means that federal institutions in the United States that hold Native American human remains and associated funerary objects, they have the duty to return these artifacts and these human remains to the communities and the native peoples that claim or that are the descendants of those people represented or embodied in those materials. And in that case, we have a very strong example of, well, the answer to who owns heritage in this case is the community, right? And again, of course, this piece of legislation has given rise to a number of discussions amongst academics, activists, indigenous peoples, the public in general. But I think it's a brilliant example of how, in some cases, heritage does have an owner. But it's always contested and it's always discussed. There are two big differences between those two examples I just gave. The first one being, of course, that there's legislation in place for the case of NAGPRA in the United States, federal legislation that applies to the United States. And in the case of Britain and Greece and the Parthenon marbles, of course, you would have to go to international pieces of legislation that have a totally different way of acting onto heritage. But perhaps the most important difference between those two examples is that in the second case we're talking about human remains. And human remains are perhaps the most contested and problematic piece of heritage that is kept in museums, because they are objects, but they are also people. So a moral, an ethical stance comes into play as well that is much more emotional and connects to people's feelings and people's descendants or ascendants in a very strong form.